I recently picked up a table saw for some remodeling work I'm doing around the house, and you probably know that if you're going to use a table saw safely, you need some kind of table to push the material onto after you run it through the saw so it doesn't just fall into the ground. This is commonly called an outfeed table. Typically, outfeed tables are just big tables with a hole cut out in the middle that you drop the saw into, but since I'm down here in a garage working with limited space, I needed something that I can easily fold up and put away when not in use. So here's how I made my super strong, compact, and collapsible outfeed table and workbench, all for about $100 in hardware and materials. The first thing I did was break down some old sawhorses I had laying around that I was using to support a sheet of OSB as my old outfeed table. The 2x4s and the sawhorses were just about the perfect lengths for what I needed for the legs in the new table, so I tried to reuse material I had lying around. Once I hammered off all of the sawhorse brackets, I trimmed the legs to length on my miter saw. Since my table is going to be 6 feet long by 3 feet wide and 36.5 inches high, which is the height of my table saw, I needed 4 lengths at 31.25 inches and 4 at 34.5. All these dimensions are in the SketchUp model, which I'll include a link to in the description. While at the miter saw, I also cut 3 8-foot studs down to 69 inches for the supports that will go under the table. More on that in a bit. I assembled the legs using half-lap joints, which allowed me to avoid using any brackets or hardware, plus half-laps are really strong once they're glued up. To cut the half-laps, I ran each 2x4 over my dado stack, measuring 3.5 inches from the edge and cutting them 3/4 of an inch deep. This allowed the legs to perfectly overlap. If you don't have a dado stack or a table saw, you can cut half-laps using a router, but I find using a table saw to be much faster and easier. Then I set about gluing everything up and checking to ensure that the framing of each leg was square. Next, I cut the top of the table from a sheet of 3/4 inch birch veneered plywood I had lying around. Ideally, I would have done this on my table saw, but since I don't have an outfeed table yet, I used my Craig AccuCut to try to make as straight a cut as possible. The AccuCut is great for ripping down sheet goods, especially for making shorter cuts that are less than 48 inches. I just wish they made a version that was twice the length and could handle full 8-foot sheets. Since the top of my table was only 3 feet in width, I used the remaining 8 inches of plywood for the back support brace, which you'll see in a moment. Once the glue on the legs was dry, I went around and reinforced the joints with 1 1/4 inch wood screws. This probably isn't really necessary, but it just gives me a little extra peace of mind. With the legs assembled, it was time to connect them to the back brace via some hinges I stole off an old folding director's chair I had lying around, but you can use any old hinges you find at your local hardware store. I used machine screws to secure the legs to the brace since it's only 3/4 inch plywood and I don't want to run the risk of them tearing out. I also drilled a shallow recess using a Forstner bit just large enough to accommodate the socket on my ratchet, which I used to tighten everything up. With the legs attached to the back brace, you can now see how the table folds up. Next, I attached the tabletop using these really interesting 270-degree hinges I picked up at Woodcraft. They're a bit spendy at about $12 a pair, but they're exactly what I needed to allow the tabletop to flip behind the back brace for storage. Before I attached the tabletop to the frame, I mounted these locking casters to the legs to make the table easier to move around. I picked them up off of Amazon, and for about $25 for a pack of 4, they're actually a pretty good deal. I'll include a link to them in the description. With the casters mounted, I attached the tabletop to the back brace using the screws provided with the hinges and carefully stood the table up. To add some stability, I glued a couple of cleats to the bottom corners to hold the 2x4 cross braces I cut earlier. I used the 2x4s to position the cleats, but it's really important to remove them when the glue is drying so they don't get stuck in place. I also added a cross brace in the center of the table to help prevent the top of the table from sagging. To help position this brace, I made these little shelves out of furring strips, glued them up, and then reinforced them with some wood screws. These aren't really necessary, but they do make it a lot easier to position the center brace and insert the locking knobs, which you'll see in a moment. I checked that the frame of the table was square to the back brace, and then drilled a hole through the frame and into the cross brace to install some threaded insert nuts that will allow me to secure the brace to the legs using a star knob. As you can see, these simply ratchet into the hole I drilled, and then the star knob just screws right in. I went around the table and did this on each side of the 3 cross braces. With the cross braces securely fastened to the legs of the table and the casters locked this time, you can see how much more secure the table is now. To ensure I don't lose those shims that help me position the center brace, I marked the inside edge of each with a Sharpie to help me orient them, and then used the star knob to secure them to the base of each leg. Next, I added a short 6-inch apron just to provide a little additional support, plus I think it looks nice. I clamped the apron to the legs of the table and then drilled holes for the threaded inserts and star knobs that will hold it in place. Since the top of the table overlaps the legs by about a half an inch, I clamped a couple of furring strips flush to the apron to give me a surface for my trim router to follow. Then I ran my router along the edge of the table using a 1-inch long trim bit to trim it flush with the apron. Once everything was flush, I attached the apron to the tabletop with another set of those 270-degree hinges. With the hinges installed, you can see how the apron flips up onto the table, which makes it really easy to store when the table is put away. To help hold the apron in place when the table is in the stored position, I mounted these little 3/4-inch kitchen magnets to the underside of both the apron and the tabletop. I used a plunge base on my router to cut the holes and then dropped a small dab of Loctite into each hole to hold the magnets in place. It probably goes without saying that it's really important to double check the orientation of the magnets before gluing them in, but I'm just going to say it here anyway, just in case. Next, I installed 3 more sets of star knobs to fasten the braces to the legs of the table, which not only gives me a convenient way to store them, but actually helps stabilize the table in the stored position and helps prevent it from falling over. With everything mounted and secured, I protected the top with a couple of coats of polyurethane and then added a light coat of paste wax to make everything nice and smooth, since I am, after all, going to be using this as my table saw outfeed table. Thanks for watching. I really hope this has been helpful. If you have any questions or suggestions on how to improve upon the design, please leave a comment below. And if you make this project, I'd love to see it. Thanks again.